Hello, welcome to This Week's World. Today we tackle the subject of Islamic extremism head-on. Where does it come from? Where will it all end up? We hear from a former Al-Qaeda member and someone close to the Muslim Brotherhood. And we talk to the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
I have a real humility about the decisions that I took and the issues around them. And, you know, I was trying to deal with this in the aftermath of 9/11. It was very tough. It was very difficult.
What's the legacy of the decisions he took? We're on the ground in Iraq. And we'll ask if Vladimir Putin's trying to break up the EU. Before all that, our panel gives us their take on the week. And here's ours in numbers. Numbers? Let's start with a big one, 1,238. The number of delegates Donald Trump secured midweek to get him over the line to be the Republican presidential candidate.
You know, it is my hair, right? You do know.
$6. That's the amount TV chef Anthony Bourdain spent on dinner for President Obama in a Hanoi street cafe. The president's historic visit to the country ahead of the G7 in Japan lifted a long-standing arms embargo. The top chef noted that he had to pick up the check. 8%, the amount Venezuela's economy is expected to shrink by in the next year amid a devastating food and energy shortage. As the country continues to fall apart, Venezuelans are preoccupied with sourcing everyday essentials with shortages of bread, medicine, even toilet paper. Finally, 51 degrees, the highest ever temperature has been recorded in India, where an ongoing heatwave is melting roads in Rajasthan. The heatwave has struck as the country contends with a major drought and worsening water shortages that have affected around 330 million people. Those were some of our numbers. Now we're joined by Mazia Bahari, who's had a film made about him by Jon Stewart, and Nesreen Malik, banker turned journalist. Nesreen, I'm going to start with you. You've picked out a female fighter pilot of the week.
Yes, so there is a Ukrainian female fighter pilot that has just been released from prison in Russia and swapped back for a couple of Russian prisoners. And the striking thing about her is that in a world where no one is able to land a glove on Putin or his regime, she has been lighting it up in prison in Russia. She has sworn at the judge, she has shouted in front of TV cameras, she's made fun of Putin publicly, and she's managed to wrestle a release from prison without asking for clemency, to the extent that Putin had to pretend that the victims, the families of the alleged victims of this woman, had themselves asked for clemency for her, so in order to save face. So she's landed in Ukraine a couple of days ago now, and she thanked those who supported her, those who didn't support her, and those who were indifferent.
She memorably, and we should say possibly offensively to some viewers, flipped Putin the bird, didn't she? That famous.
She did. She was kind of, I think, expressing a lot of people's desire at the time to do so.
Mazia, another strong female voice coming through in your pick. I think you called it Hot Drink of the Week. Take us through it.
Yes. Being Iranian, the hot drink of the week must be tea. And this is a tea that the daughter of the former president of Iran, Hashemi Rafsanjani, one of the founders of the Iranian Revolution, one of the closest disciples of Ayatollah Khomeini, had with the leader of the Baha'i religion in Iran. The Baha'is are the largest minority in Iran. There are 300,000 Baha'is. They are denied of many citizen rights. And when I was working in Iran, I remember I could not discuss many issues. They called them red lines. But the Baha'i issue was the reddest of the red lines. So for the daughter of a founder of the Iranian Revolution, meeting a leader of the Baha'i religion is revolutionary. That was the tea, a hot drink that shook Iran.
We're going to leave hot tea and go to something slightly more muscular. This is Smackdown of the week.
Smackdown of the week. So Hulk Hogan, I don't know if you recall, a few months ago, sued the wrestler, sued Gawker for leaking a videotape of him having.
This is Gawker's a sort of gossip.
Yeah, it's sort of an aggregated gossip / celebrity stalking website that has managed to reveal a lot about celebrity sex lives and also out a lot of popular people as gay. And so he took them to court, he won, he got a huge settlement, and Gawker is sort of struggling to pay, and it's not a very popular site amongst media professionals because it's sort of a bit unsavoury and plays quite dirty. But what has galvanised the media establishment against Hulk Hogan unexpectedly in support of Gawker is that it has been revealed that a Silicon Valley billionaire called Peter Thiel jail, has financed Hulk Hogan's campaign against Gawker in order to bankrupt them because Gawker outed him as gay about 4 years ago. And it set off this incredibly interesting counterintuitive alignment of interests because people are now, who usually are not very big fans of Gawker, supporting it because they feel that private interests should not have the right to basically destroy media establishments because they can afford to.
So Gawker's now at the centre of this. Mazia, I give the last word to you. I don't know how you want to phrase this. We could go with poem of the week or organ of the week.
The story is about this Burmese poet, Maung Sanka, who wrote a 5-line poem. In the poem, he says that he has a tattoo of the president on his penis. Can we say penis on television?
You just have that.
Okay, well, I have, yeah. Anyways, so he has that tattoo, and that he just got married, and his newlywed saw that tattoo, and she's horrified, inconsolably horrified. And because of that, he went to prison.
I guess the wider point is this is still happening in Burma when you think that things have started to change.
And that's what surprised this poem. But there are many similarities between Iran and Burma in a sense that even though there are some forces for reform in the executive branch, the judiciary, the courts, are still in the hands of the very small clique of people. In Iran, you have the clerics who are holding the key to the courts.
You've served time
I served time in Iranian jail. I was arrested because of an article I wrote, and this man, he was sent to jail by courts which are in the hands of the military in Burma because of this poem. And it's very interesting, and on a high note, we have to finish it on a high note, he said that the government of Burma, if it wants to be an efficient, good government, has to understand poetry.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in. With much of the Middle East engulfed in bitter conflict, this week's World will be taking a hard look at new ideas for how to fight violent extremists like Islamic State. We'll hear from Tony Blair, then from his critics. So what can be done to counteract the endless brutality perpetrated in Islam's name? Islamist is a controversial term. It's meant to describe something different to Islam, the faith. Rather, it's a set of political ideologies tied to religious principles. Here's some of the history. The 20th century saw various peaceful Muslim political parties emerge. They believed the state should be based on Sharia law and principles. From 1979, small but ever more violent splinter groups spun off from them. Sunni extremists fought a jihad, or holy war, against Russia in Afghanistan. And that year, Shiite Islamists overthrew the Shah of Iran. As Britain's Prime Minister after 9/11 attacks by Al-Qaeda, Tony Blair was a part of the global response, which began with a war aiming to root out extremists in Afghanistan. And then there's 2003 and Iraq. Previously secular, the country became a magnet for foreign jihadis, and ultimately the so-called Islamic State emerged and took swathes of territory. Until last year, Blair was Middle East peace envoy for the Quartet powers. Now he's arguing for a new approach, not just fighting a small group of violent fanatics, but also countering the broader ideologies of Islamism.
I think the ideology of Islamism and the idea that you have a view of religion that governs politics, society, the economy, the way people live and work and think, I think it is certainly in its more extreme forms the single biggest threat that we face today.
How many people do you think share that ideology?
The numbers of people who engage in fanaticism, who engage in the terrorist activities, are relatively small. You can number those in tens of thousands. The numbers who believe significant parts of the ideology, I think you can number in millions. I mean, some of these radical clerics will have Twitter followings going into many millions of people. The Muslim Brotherhood, and not all parts of the Muslim Brotherhood think the same, by the way, but many parts of the Muslim Brotherhood who share a pretty extreme view of the world, I mean, their membership goes into many millions.
So would you define those people then as extremists? People that don't advocate terrorism? The Queen's speech, for example, recently spoke of counter-extremism measures. Would you try to, as it were, clamp down on what they believe?
Well, you can't, as it were, stop people believing what they believe, but you can counter it, because it is important to counter it, and you can make sure that young people aren't educated to a way of thinking that's closed-minded towards others. My idea is very simple. We need a coming together in a global commitment on education where countries agree that within their education systems, they will promote cultural tolerance and root out cultural prejudice. And they should do that with the systems that are formal or informal. Because if you end up polluting the mind of young people as they're growing up within your country, in today's world where the boundaries come down, where there's much more migration and integration, then that is a problem not just for your country, it's a problem for all of us. And we can see this in what's happening in the world.
You've always stressed how important it is that countries around the world in the Middle East get to choose their own leaders. You'd presumably side with the democratic process which elected the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Yeah, I side with the democratic process. I think the Muslim Brotherhood were a real problem for Egypt. And the reason why you had that popular revolt where literally millions and millions of people came out on the street is that having experienced that government and seeing how they were effectively taking the basic norms of society away and distorting them, I also supported the counter-revolution that removed them.
I mean, isn't the problem that we like democracy until it throws up the wrong answer?
I don't think that's fair, actually. I think, of course, there are lots of democratic results you disagree with. The problem, however, is if you get people who are democratically elected, and the Muslim Brotherhood is a very good example of what I'm about to say in Egypt, but then they are systematically taking away the institutions of the country so that if you like, it's this election we're going to win, but by the time you get to the next election, the rules of the game have been significantly changed, then I think you've got a different type of problem. But ultimately, the real question is, do you want an economy that is rule-based and a society that is religiously tolerant? Those are the two things that are, I think, as important as simply whether you have the vote or you don't have the vote.
Where does Saudi, a dictatorship, fit into that pattern then? Because it seems that the argument for democracy runs out there because they're a friend, they're an ally, in your words.
No, I think for Saudi it's a classic case of where you want it to evolve over time. There are deep-seated challenges economically, socially in Saudi.
That sounds like a cop-out to people saying, you know, either you agree with democracy and people choosing their own leaders, or else you say, let's let it evolve.
But if it is evolving, that's possibly better to let it evolve and let it evolve in a way that preserves the stability of the country, which is, after all, vital for the stability of the region.
You'll be manifestly aware that there will be people screaming at their screens right now that this man is the problem, the cause, if you like, not the solution.
Yeah, but they've got to, I'm afraid people have really got to come to their senses on this. You've got to track this back over decades. You know, this didn't, 9/11 came before anyone had intervened anywhere. Okay, so let's not kid ourselves about this. The problem is that when you have these radical Islamist elements stepping into a situation where you've got a vacuum of power, then it's so much harder to get the country on its feet and moving forward.
You concede that vacuum of power was aided, was created by the invasion of Iraq and by the removal of the Iraqi army and the Sunni infrastructure around it.
You can say certainly that the removal of Saddam created a situation in which you then had to supplant it with a different form of government. But let's not kid ourselves again. The people of Iraq were desperate for change and welcomed the fact that they had a new government. Now, what happened there is that into that process of change has come people whose desire has been specifically to disrupt it by terrorism.
But the disbanding of the Iraqi army, that was pointed by Petraeus as one of the biggest mistakes of that whole time. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think you can say in retrospect that it shouldn't have happened, and people have said that, and I understand exactly why they say it, although I just simply say to you that those of us who were there at the time, it was a much, much tougher set of decisions, precisely because the people were saying, we don't want these people who've been governing us and brutalizing us over the years to be in charge of us. It's not the root of the problem.
Well, let's take this further. Anas Al-Tikriti says he's often described as an Islamist. He's British-Iraqi, a hostage negotiator whose father led the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq. Amon Deen is a former Al-Qaeda operative who for nearly a decade was an agent for the UK government. Nice to have you both on this week's World. Thanks for joining us. You heard Tony Blair say there, Islamism in its extreme form is the biggest single threat we face today. Anas, do you see yourself as an Islamist? What does that mean?
I have absolutely no idea. One of the marks of Tony Blair's interview is the fact that he has littered his thesis with terms that really have no firm definition. Yes, you're correct. I'm often described as an Islamist. It was never of my choice. I have no idea what it means.
A believer in political Islam who would like to see Islam as a central tenet to any state.
Then no. The answer would be no. But that's the problem, you see. I have no platform, apart from this programme, in order to say, listen, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about these terms. And the way in which this very reductionist, simplistic division of a region housing hundreds of millions of people, you know, of a particular culture, of a particular religion, of a particular creed, of a multitude of races and ethnicities and the such, into, you know, Islamists and liberals or Democrats and non-Democrats is problematic, is entirely problematic. There is a myriad of elements that make up the region.
But what is reductionist about saying we need a global interpretation of the values of open-mindedness?
The reductionist element here is the fact that, according to Tony Blair, history started with 9/11, and that is entirely problematic. The fact of the matter is that this region has had these people, these same people, the same culture, the same religion for 14 centuries, and never have we seen the level of violence, the complexity of violence, the sophistication of violence, the advancement of violence as we have seen since 2003.
Amon Deen, let me bring you into this. Tony Blair has said that these Islamist ideas are widespread, in the millions. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, of course. At the end of the day, the problem didn't start with 9/11. I agree with Anas Tikriti there. The problem started with, I would say, the year 1979. It is a year where, you know, the great Muslim civil war, if I could, you know, describe it this way, started because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Saddam took over power in Iraq, Khomeini seized power in Iran, and the forces of, let's put it this way, fundamentalist Muslim Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca briefly. All of these events together paved the way for the rise of the ideology of jihad in order to achieve change on the ground. Now, so really, it is a problem that is 37 years in the making.
You espoused...
And therefore, no wonder we have millions.
You espoused that ideology of jihad for a time. You were with Al-Qaeda. Now, what made you leave or turn?
I think I was more or less starting to realize that we are heading towards a clash of civilizations, that we cannot win. No one will win. Everyone will lose. And this is the realization that I more or less came to embrace in 1998 after the East Africa bombings in Nairobi and Tanzania. I just realized basically that we are heading into a dangerous path.
IS believes they can win this. So how do you end it? So
we're not really winning. The fact of the matter is that we, again, with Amon, I partly agree, but I disagree with the fact that he starts everything from 1979. I think one of the problems is, and this is part of the problem with what Tony Blair is saying, is that the West is sort of washing its hands of generations of propping up regimes which have brutalized, which have oppressed, and ultimately led to a sector of people, as Amon put it, thinking that there is no way out.
What do you mean? The West should be washing their hands or they shouldn't? Do you want intervention? Do you not?
I'd rather that there was absolutely no intervention of any kind of sort. But I agree with Tony Blair on the fact that today we live in a global village. We can't sort of say, well, you know what, you can do it as you wish and I won't be affected. We've seen how that doesn't really really work. But at the same time, to say that, listen, all this has nothing to do with me, and what's happening today, everything that we're seeing in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, that has absolutely nothing to do with me. I've done my bit, I've helped you, and I'm here, and I'm absolutely, clean in terms of my conscience, and all this is upon you.
To be
I
fair,
think that is
he's
problematic.
saying, I'm coming back, and this time with a solution, which is education. Last word to you, Amon Deen. Do you think you can come back and say, we need to re-educate?
Well, of course, education is important. But at the end of the day, before education, you need to have some sort of peace in the region. You have to have some peace within Muslim factions. We have a problem where militant Shia Islam is fighting against militant Sunni Islam, where we have people who espouse a political framework of Islam like the Muslim Brotherhood are actually in conflict with the Arab monarchies of the region. So the problem is, before you educate people, you need actually to bring them together in order to have some sort of peace, or at least a ceasefire, where the forces of sectarianism and the forces of fundamentalism basically, bring the region back from the brink. Unfortunately, we don't see that at all.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. We'll hear more from Tony Blair and what he sees as his legacy a little later in the programme. But first, with so much of the critique of him centring around Iraq, what of life on the ground now? Jim Muir has followed Iraq's story for 4 decades.
This is Iraq today. Life does still go on here, and sometimes it can seem tranquil enough. But this is not a normal, peaceful country. It's a place of concrete blast walls and barbed wire, of checkpoints and men with guns. A place where people who go shopping in markets get blown to pieces. Where Shia militias, created by Iran, are battling Sunni extremists, cities laid waste. Where government is paralyzed by factional rifts, parliament invaded by rioters. How did it come to this? The Blitzkrieg, unleashed in March 2003, did a lot more than remove Saddam Hussein. 130,000 US troops and nearly 30,000 British occupied the country. They found no weapons of mass destruction. But they dissolved every structure in a tightly controlled dictatorship, the ruling Ba'ath Party, the security apparatus, crucially the Iraqi army. Adnan Janabi is one of the few politicians who was an MP under Saddam Hussein and is still one now.
The people in the army were not only disbanded, they were cut off. Their salaries were not paid. Not only the army, the military industries people, some of whom are now making bombs for Daesh and before that Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda.
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, linked to Al-Qaeda, moved into Iraq almost as soon as the invasion happened. Within just a few months, the UN compound in Baghdad was demolished by a massive bomb attack carried out by Sunni extremists and disgruntled Baathists. 10 days later, a similar outrage killed a revered Shia cleric, Ayatollah Hakim, setting a pattern of sectarian provocation that continues today. Hisham al-Hashimi was a political prisoner under Saddam Hussein. He was lucky to survive. Many others perished under his repressive rule. But even he agrees that people were more secure and safe under Saddam.
في أيام صدام حسين لم تحدث إلا عملية إرهابية واحدة وألقي القبض على الجماعة المنفذة وتم إعدامه.
والآن بعد سقوط صدام تغير مو؟
حقيقة العراق أصبح كالبركان الذي بدأ ينفث بعض تلك الحمم سوف تصل إلى كل من حوله وتصل إلى الآخرين.
The bitter grievances felt by Saddam Hussein's minority Sunni community provided absolutely perfect soil for extremists to take root in. First of all, Al-Qaeda, now so-called Islamic State. It was in Iraq's second city, Mosul, that the leader of IS, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, proclaimed his caliphate 2 years ago. But the invasion of 2003 was a godsend to another power regarded by the West as hostile, Iran. If anybody was dedicated to containing Iranian influence, it was Saddam Hussein. In 1980, he sent his troops into mainly Shia Iran, hoping to puncture the Iranian Islamic Revolution. That started a war that lasted 8 years and claimed perhaps 1 million lives. Even before the 2003 invasion, Iran was already moving. I watched this Shia Iraqi militia, the Badr organization, parading after it crossed the border into Iraq just before the invasion. It was formed, armed, trained and commanded by the Iranians. Fast forward 13 full years, and this is still the Badr organization here in Iraq. They've been through the sectarian bloodletting of 2005 and 6 and 7, and now here they are as part of this huge force that's attacking towards Fallujah here in the very Sunni Anbar province as part of a big campaign to get rid of the militants, the Sunni militants of the Islamic State. The battle for Fallujah is part of a struggle that has devastated cities, turned more than 3 million Iraqis into refugees and beggars in their own country, and it's not over yet. Almost every day, there are terrible suicide bombs that kill dozens. At the centre, politics is deadlocked by sectarian factionalism, parliament and government unable even to meet. At this stage, nobody even knows if Iraq is going to stick together as one country. All this is the legacy of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Jim Muir. Well, after 7 years and around 2 million words, John Chilcott's report on the invasion and its aftermath will finally emerge on July the 6th. I asked the former Prime Minister for his reflections ahead of the report's publication.
I have a real humility about the decisions that I took and the issues around them. And, you know, I was trying to deal with this in the aftermath of 9/11. It was very tough. It was very difficult. I think it's important that we also, you know, we have humility about then the next phase of policy making. So we try and actually learn the lessons of the whole period since that time. And I think if we do that and we have an exchange that isn't, you know, a trading of barbs and insults, but is an attempt really to understand what we're dealing with, then we'll, you know, we can confront this problem and overcome it. But my anxiety at the moment is we're still lost in the West in a very narrow debate. We're not seeing this issue in its broader dimensions. We haven't caused this problem. How we deal with it, you can have strong disagreements about. But the roots of it are deep, and we need to get to those roots.
That debate's going to come to a head, of course, in 6 weeks' time. Are you worried that findings from the inquiry may inflame tensions in the Middle East?
Well, I can't comment on it because I don't know. But I don't think that it's going to come to a head in 6 weeks, and I don't think it's going to be resolved in 6 weeks. This is a specific inquiry into a specific event. This problem predated it, postdated it, and it's going to be with us for a long time. So, sure, we'll have that debate when the report's published, and you know, I'm not going to comment on it before then. But whatever people think about that, you've got to open your eyes to the problem. And if we don't do that, we're going to store up an even bigger problem for ourselves. So this is a different type of threat from anything we have faced before. It requires a different type of policy response, and it requires a different rhythm of thinking where we understand this is a generation fight. It's not a fight that's going to be resolved in 1 year, 2 years, or even 10.
You accept that your understanding of the Middle East is much deeper today than it was as Prime Minister. Is it possible then that everything, that whole invasion, was based on a misunderstanding of the region?
No, I don't. I think in the end, you know, there will have to be change, and sometimes there are regimes that are only ever going to go when they're removed, as it were. But what I do think is, if you look back in these last years, and you don't just learn the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, but you also learn the lessons of the Arab Spring, then I think that the combination of economic, social, and religious factors is such that if you can manage a process of change over time, that is the better way to go.
You spend so much time thinking about this now, and a lot of your time in the Middle East. When you come back here, home, the vilification of Tony Blair goes on. I wonder if that's hard.
It's the way it is, but I mean, it's, you know, look, also you've got to understand, I mean, there are people who disagree with me for reasons that they say are to do, say, with Iraq, but actually are to do with the fact that I won 3 elections for the Labour Party and they didn't like it.
Do you think Corbyn is your child?
You mean
the
Corbyn is
result
the product
you?
of me, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I think it's the product of the way the world works today, but it's a big challenge for the centre. And when I'm not thinking about the Middle East, I'm thinking about this, because I do think, by the way, it would be a very dangerous experiment for a major Western country to get gripped by this type of populist policymaking, left or right.
Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you.
With that thought of winning elections, bear this in mind and perhaps practice saying the words President Donald Trump. Who knows? One day you might need to. So here's a radical thought. What if Trump emerged as the most moderate Republican candidate in decades?
Donald Trump is a moderate.
They're bringing drugs, extremism, they're rapists, and then there's ISIS.
Let me say that again. Donald Trump is a moderate. His style might be a little crass, and he said things that some say should bar him from the Oval Office.
A total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
So, we get the impression that voters have picked the most right-wing candidate they could. But in many policy areas, he's actually the most moderate candidate for decades. Take government spending. He's no conservative. In fact, he's a big spender, as you may have noticed. He wants the rich to pay more tax, he's anti-free trade, and he wants to protect American jobs with tariffs. On foreign policy, he said that 9/11 was Bush's fault, and that Iraq was a disaster, that he wouldn't have gone into Libya, and that he'd be happy to talk to Russia. Sounds like someone else I know. So, if you're worried about his finger on the nuclear button, don't. Trump is running on an anti-war platform.
Our military dominance must be unquestioned.
Sort of. So what's going on? Is Trump a secret Democrat? No. The truth is, he's just making it up as he goes along. But his instincts are far to the left of the modern Republican Party, so maybe that's Trump's secret weapon. As his party becomes more ideologically conservative, his moderation is his strength. And if his ideological flexibility has taken him this far, who knows? Maybe it'll take him even a little further. And after November, we'll all have to get used to saying, President Trump.
Well, talking of secret weapons, is Russia waging a new kind of warfare on the EU to try and break up the Union? And would a Brexit therefore be in Russia's best interest, as David Cameron recently suggested? The EU has started its own task force to counter what it considers to be Russian disinformation. Are they being paranoid, or might they have a point? Tim Hewell's been watching Moscow for 30 years.
Is Vladimir Putin using hybrid warfare to destabilise the EU? Hybrid warfare can refer to any form of aggression short of open invasion. And Putin's critics say that it's his way to force Europe to drop its sanctions against Russia.
Russia's interest in breaking up Europe is clear, and it uses a variety of means, everything it can do possible to achieve this breakup.
So what's Putin actually accused of? Weaponising information. The EU's so worried about information warfare, it set up a special myth-busting unit to combat it. Russia spends millions spreading its version of reality in Europe, including sometimes fabrications, like the story of Lisa, a 13-year-old Russian girl living in Germany. After she vanished for a day last January, Russian media quoted her family saying she'd been raped by migrants, and German police were covering it up. That led to anti-government protests in Germany and a diplomatic spat after Russia accused Berlin of whitewashing reality with political correctness. But it turned out Lisa was never raped. So was the story just a Kremlin weapon against Chancellor Merkel? Moscow says that's absurd. Cyber warfare. For a few terrifying hours in 2007, cyber attacks almost shut down the small Baltic state of Estonia. Even supermarket checkouts didn't work. Many blamed the Kremlin, but expert investigations failed to prove it. Last year, cyber attacks were reported on the German parliament and Bulgarian state websites, with Russia widely suspected. But again, no actual proof. political warfare. Does Russia fund anti-EU political parties? US intelligence is now investigating that. Russia certainly backs France's far-right National Front. The National Front approved Russia's takeover of Crimea, and a Russian bank then lent it millions of euros. Are Germany's Eurosceptic AfD party and Hungary's far-right Jobbik also taking Kremlin cash? Some say yes, but they deny it, and there's no evidence yet. In any case, the Kremlin says, both sides play the same game. Europe has long tried to spread its views in Russia and other former Soviet states. The West calls that soft power. So how does it differ from what Russia does in Europe?
The West doesn't have the kinds of tools inside Russia that Russia has inside the West. In any way, the West isn't able to organize all the tools of the state against Russia the way Russia is attempting to use them against the West.
No comparison then, Russia's critics say. Hybrid warfare's a reality. And if they can't prove that Putin is waging it, that's because, by definition, hybrid warfare can't be proved.
I'm joined by the Russian ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Chizov, from our studio in Brussels. Ambassador, what do you make of this allegation of hybrid warfare?
First of all, to recognize the allegation, one needs to have a clear picture what the term of hybrid warfare is all about. Actually, if you stretch it into history, you might end up with elements of hybrid warfare during the Roman Empire or ancient Greece or medieval conflicts across Europe and the rest of the world.
So it's not a denial exactly.
Well, hybrid warfare depends on what you mean.
Well, I put to you in the report some of those allegations that Russia is trying to infiltrate or to, if you like, influence EU politics.
Why would Russia want that or need that? I would say there is a misperception very widely spread, not only in the European Union, but beyond, that Russia is ostensibly trying to split the European Union, trying to drive wedges between individual member states of the EU and primarily between the EU as an entity and its member states. All those allegations are totally wrong.
Would Brexit make any difference?
Well, there will be fewer EU countries if that happens.
And is that a good thing for Russia or a bad thing?
Well, Russian-British relations will not stop, of course. Russia-EU relations will not stop, but it's not our show in any way.
So what are we to make of these strong financial links, then, between Russia and arch Eurosceptics in France, Marine Le Pen? Does Putin want her to succeed for the Front National?
By referring to strong financial links, I assume you mean a certain loan that the National Front in France got from a Czech bank.
From a Russian bank, wasn't it?
That is linked to a Russian bank. Well,
right.
No, it was a Czech bank linked to a Russian bank.
All right, let me just say that the US are investigating this link. So presumably they see it as coming from Russia and from Russia's government.
Well, they're free to investigate whatever they like, but certainly the Russian government has nothing to do with it.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that is all from this week's World. Before we leave you, though, there are a couple of questions that had Tony Blair stumped. One of them was entirely my fault. Goodbye. Do you think you are the heir to Corbyn?
I'm the heir to Corbyn.
Sorry, let me try that one again. Donald Trump predicted last week that Chilcot would be terrible for you. Is there any bit of that sentence that you'd like to unpick?
No, I think I'll leave Donald Trump to Donald Trump.